In this video, we are going to look at the basic structure of cells. So, as a review, remember that all living things are made of cells. We have unicellular or multicellular organisms. Now, a cell is the smallest unit of life. So, a cell can either live on its own, like a unicellular organism, or be part of a multicellular organism's tissues, like we have muscle cells that make up our muscle tissue. All cells need to do a number of things. Number one, hold everything together. Number two, control what goes in and out. They need to allow for cellular reactions. So that means they have to have the space, the structures, and the materials to be able to do that. They need to be able to store DNA. And especially in the case of multicellular organisms, the cells have to be able to communicate with each other. So they do this with things called organelles. An organelle is a specific structure within a cell that has a specific function. So think of them like organs for the cell. Now, we are going to look in this video at the specific organelles that all cells have to have. So all cells are going to have these structures. Number one is a cell or plasma membrane. Those two are interchangeable. Cytoplasm and ribosomes. So first, let's look at the cell membrane. The cell membrane is really important. One of the big job that it has is really to just hold everything together. It goes around the outside of the cell and keeps things from just floating away. Number two, it controls what goes in and out because the cell wants to keep certain things in and keep certain things out. And we call this being selectively permeable. That means that certain things can go in and out and certain things can't. Now, plasma membranes are mostly made of lipids. And if you remember, these are phospholipids. And in a membrane, they are arranged as a bilayer. So here's an example of how that bilayer works. Each one of the circles with two tails, that is a phospholipid, and they're arranged in two different layers. Now, in addition to lipids, we also have proteins, which act, among other things, in transporting materials across the membrane, and carbohydrates, which act to help communicate. So, the way I think you should think about this is think of membranes like a fence. The phospholipids are like the main part of the fence, kind of the pickets. They are selectively permeable. Certain things can move across. Proteins are like the gates. They allow other things to be able to move across that fence that we really want. And then finally, the carbohydrates are like the signs that let people know what's going on. So here's my overall picture of a membrane. I have the lipid bilayer. I have carbohydrates for communication and proteins for transporting materials across. And then finally, here's kind of how selective permeability works. Some molecules are too big and they can't pass through the membrane. Some molecules are really small and they can. And so the fact that some things can move through and some things can't, that's called being selectively permeable. Now, the cytoplasm is pretty simple for our perspective because all we're going to really think about it is as the fluid in the cell. So cells are mostly filled with water and proteins and things like that. And the cytoplasm is basically that fluid in the cell. And it allows for the movement of materials. It's the medium for reactions to occur in. It's also just where everything is just kind of floating. So here it shows the cytoplasm on the inside, that's the fluid on the inside, and then very often there's water on the outside of the cells. Ribosomes are really important. They make proteins in the cell. Okay, so all cells need enzymes, so all cells need ribosomes. They're like little factories that help build proteins. And interestingly enough, they are actually made of proteins. They're enzymes themselves. So they're proteins that build other proteins. And when we look at them in a cell, they look like little dots. If we blow them up, it looks a little bit more like this thing on the right. But either way, all cells are going to have these so that they can build proteins. Now, if we try to build the most basic cell, so this is kind of like the basic foundation of a living thing, we have to have a cell membrane. So that's holding everything in. We got to have cytoplasm on the inside of that cell. That's that fluid. Got to have ribosomes in order to build the proteins, the enzymes that it needs. And we got to have some DNA that codes for the proteins so that the ribosomes can put them together. And then finally, the next two lessons, we're going to learn about the two main types of cells. So the first one is prokaryotes. And what we'll see is that these are very small and simple, whereas eukaryotes are going to be much more complex and much larger. And they're going to have a lot of different structures. So we're going to look at a number of additional organelles as we move forward.